Sounds like a good idea. Thank you very much. Complexity and freedom, it's a little bit of an ambitious subject. I hope it works. I'm going to attempt to present a certain theory of some scientific principles of how nature works. I'm going to try to relate that to social networks, and I'm going to try to make some preposterous conclusions about what that has to do with freedom. Like first, complexity, it will be necessary to explain it a little bit, because in normal daily usage, complexity is about the same as saying that it's complicated. And scientifically, that's not really the case, but science doesn't particularly agree either. There's about 32 different definitions of complexity in science that don't agree with each other either. And I'm not a scientist. I don't really know a hell of a lot about the things I'm talking about, but I'm going to make it simple at least. So one way of saying it is something is complicated if it has a great many different parts that are difficult to put together, and it's difficult to understand exactly how you do that. It's hard to figure out. Like an A380 is complicated. It has a great many different parts, and you couldn't put it together yourself. Something is complex if it might have many parts, it might not, but there's something more to it than the parts you put together. You put the parts together, or the parts are together, and it does something surprising, interesting. Maybe it's alive. Like most parts of nature are complex. They might additionally be complicated to figure out, but they're complex. They do something. And it's not necessarily easy to understand. That's a way of making it very simple. Now, there are different kinds of systems, and the question is, what is nature? Most people actually think it's an equilibrium, it's in balance. Something that's in balance is if you touch it, nothing much happens. Things stay pretty much the same way that you leave them, and it sort of adjusts itself if something is out of balance. Complexity is what we're going to talk about, but there's also chaos. Chaos, that's when things are a big mess and you have difficulty predicting what exactly will happen. And most regular people would think that nature is in an equilibrium, but it's not, surprisingly. It self-organizes towards what's called criticality, which is what we're going to talk about. Criticality is a type of complexity. It means that nature moves towards a state where it's on the critical edge between different states. If it were in equilibrium, it would be a lot more boring than it is. A lot of the things we expect from life wouldn't really be there. Evolution wouldn't happen. We wouldn't be sitting here today if it was all in equilibrium. So now one way of understanding this thing about criticality is if we look at piles of sand, for example. Like if on the floor here, if I had some grains of sand and I dropped them down on the floor, they would just start stacking up on the floor. Nothing much would happen at first, but they would gradually form a pile. And the pile would just get higher and higher, and it would get to a certain point where the weight of the grains versus friction and gravity would start making certain parts of the pile start sliding down. Avalanches would happen, and the point where most of the pile is in a state where things are ready to start sliding, that's the critical state. And it wouldn't happen at first. At first it would just be sand, a few little grains would fall, but at a certain point in time, almost no matter where you put a grain of sand, something will happen. Maybe just a little bit, maybe a lot. Maybe the whole pile will slide down. You don't really know, and that's the interesting part. And this is very dense, but I'm going to try to make it simple. Self-organized criticality. It's actually a scientific principle that was invented by a Danish guy named Per Bak with a team of other theoretical scientists. But it's about a type of system that has a critical point as an attractor. That will mean that when you leave it to its self. When a self organizes, it moves towards a critical state. There are other things it could move towards, like something chaotic or something balanced, but it moves towards that things are critical. And there are certain characteristics which I will explain a little bit later of how you can recognize it. In part, one of the things is that it's scale invariant, which means it works at any scale, at any size, like fractals, like power laws, which I'm going to explain a little bit more. And also what's interesting is it's not all that difficult to create a system like that. You don't need to fine-tune a lot of parameters. It's not about getting the numbers exactly right for a critical state to appear. It's more like it's so robust that it will happen by itself if you just leave things alone. So now these are some of the places where we find self-organized criticality in nature, like avalanches and sand piles. Earthquakes follow these principles exactly. How coastlines are developed, how rivers flow, the pattern of how different species go extinct, evolution, weather patterns, cosmology, neurobiology, the brain, the way that neurons connect together. All of it follow almost the same patterns. And it also interestingly happens in our human activities, the way populations are distributed, traffic patterns, income distribution in society, prices on the market, which music is popular. It's very prevalent in social networks, how many links one has between websites. It happens in our language. And what is it that happens? That's one of the hints is power laws, but I'll show you an example. To the right, we have a lot of earthquakes that have happened over a certain period of time in a certain area in the US. And one has measured the size of the earthquake on the Richter scale, and then one has plotted it on a graph. And to the right, we have the magnitude of earthquake, and up there we have how many did we have of those. And this is a logarithmic scale, which means, how many of you know what a logarithm is? This is math, but it's not everybody who's into that. Okay, essentially it means that every time you go one jump, it's not just 1 unit more, but it's more a power of that 1 unit more. It's like on the Richter scale, I forgot how exactly it goes, but if you went 2 steps on the Richter scale, you have 1,000 times as much power as you had before. So it's like you very much get more and more power as you just take a couple of steps on a logarithmic scale. And that's a very key point. So, and also this scale is logarithmic, which means from 1 to 10, from 10 to 100. What it means is there's a large number of small earthquakes, and there are very few really large earthquakes. And there's a fairly exact formula for how that is distributed. And it works at any scale. So essentially there will be 4 times as many earthquakes with half the size. It's sort of the principle. Okay, that's earthquakes. And what we see there are power laws. One has talked a lot about power laws in social networks, but really it comes from nature, and it's right at home in this theory of criticality. And really what it is there are very, what are we showing here? Essentially the idea is there's a great many very small events that happen, and there are very few large events. And I don't know what this scale shows actually, but yeah, I think you get the point. But the idea is that's really how it shows. There's some big events that there are very few of, and there's some small events that there's a great many of. And when one shows that on a double logarithmic scale, it's a straight line. Normally with social networks, one is focused on, well, is that fair that a few people have 30,000 friends in Facebook and some of us don't? Or what about books that there's nobody looking at, or long tails? One can look at it in different ways, but In nature, it's simply a way that things are distributed. In nature, this is fair. It just means that things are spread out in a certain way, and it also means that they're organized in the critical state, which is what we're going to use for something. So it happens in many different places. These are extinctions in the last 600 million years, which one can plot extinctions on a graph, and it more or less gives a power law, a straight line, when we have these logarithmic scales. And it also happens in various human activities. A power law is also known as Zipf's law sometimes, because a gentleman named Zipf studied the sizes of human cities, which exactly follow a distribution of a power law, which means if you have a city with 1 million people, there'll be 4 times as many cities with half the population. There would be 4 cities that have 500,000. There would be 8 that have 250,000. And it goes in both directions, which is sort of surprising because nobody has planned it, but that's just the way things happen if you don't do it any different way. It happens with prices on a market. This is a study of cotton prices and how big jumps it makes every month, and still we get some straight lines in double logarithmic coordinate systems. Okay, so we've recognized the critical point phenomenon by the power laws. That's the easiest one to understand. We also recognize them by fractal geometry, which is actually another way of saying a very similar thing, but it's like we see very intricate patterns that you can see at many different scales that tend to be self-similar at different scales. The 1 over f noise, I will explain that in a second. And also what's interesting about these phenomena is they can be quite easily simulated with what's called cellular automata. How many people know what a cellular automaton is? Yeah, okay, the Conway's life game. I'll show some examples in a moment, but it means you can simulate something in a grid work of simple cells with simple rules for how they relate to each other. And surprisingly, we can simulate to a great extent very huge phenomena in nature like evolution, earthquakes, and many other things like that. And this is something, self-organized criticality is something we see in slow-moving systems that are not in an equilibrium, and they have extended degrees of freedom, which means all the pieces can, in principle, do all sorts of unexpected things. Like out in nature, any animal can pretty much go and do whatever it wants to do. There's no authority that tells it anything else, but somehow it works out. And obviously, we see it in social networks. How many incoming links in blogs, or how many, this is a similar thing from Technorati. This is Clay Shirky's thing of readers of different blogs. It follows the same kinds of curves. This is, if it's on a double logarithmic system, you would see the straight line. Okay, so one of the characteristics is scale invariance, which is an odd word if one is not a mathematician. I'm not. But one thing it means is that there's no standard size of stuff that's self-organized in this way. Like there's no standard size of an earthquake. You can do averages, but there's no normal size of what an earthquake is. Just like in a social network, there's no standard number of friends one has, like in life. Some people have few, some people have many, and it distributes itself so that the number of people who have a huge number of friends are exponentially less than the people who have fewer. And the scale invariance is also like fractals. You look at it, you can keep looking deeper and deeper into it or further and further out, and you see the same kinds of patterns all the time. Another way of saying scale invariance is when we're talking about networks, a scale-free network says the same kind of thing, that if we make the network bigger, it doesn't change how many friends one has. Well, a little bit maybe on the internet, but in principle, it works at any scale. You make it twice as big, it's the same kind of stuff that happens. It's not that one has to have twice as many friends because we have twice as many people on the network. It would be cumbersome. Okay, there was this, one of the characteristics is F is frequency. So there's a certain type of noise which is called pink noise, which we most associate with what you see in nature. Like there's white noise, which is very random and it sounds a little sort of harsh and not very pleasant. There's red noise, which is completely random. It's not overly pleasant either. The most pleasant one is pink noise. And one way we recognize it is the power of different, the power is the inverse of the frequency. And the result of that is that each octave has the same amount of power. That sounds a little odd, but that's how our musical system is created. And that's what seems to sound pleasing to our ears. And another way of putting it is that it's all frequencies mixed together. You find very low frequency signals that are very strong, but they're low frequency, which means they're very slow moving. And you find very high frequency signals, they are not so strong. And all of these are mixed together. So you find that in natural phenomena, like if you have a river that's flowing, the whole river is following a certain low frequency signal, that all of the water is moving, and inside the river there are little eddies and currents that have the smaller frequencies, and all of them are mixed together, and that still follows power laws exactly. This is actually another way of representing the same thing as the power law, just in terms of how different frequencies happen at the same time. And you see it, for example, with these graphs of how the stock market moves, or extinction, or something like that. They're low frequency signals that are moving slowly, and in between there's like noise that are like adjusting the signal. That's an example of this. It's also a fractal pattern over time. And you all know fractals, which is essentially created with relatively simple math, but gets to look amazingly much like nature. And it's amazing in that it has fine structure at all scales, and it tends to sort of not exactly repeat itself, but there continue to be detail overlaid on other detail, and it has some similarity as you go down through other dimensions. Now, a cellular automaton, as I mentioned before, it's simply you create a grid with different cells. And this is an example of a simple one-dimensional cellular automaton. You can have different rules for, if you have 3 black cells, then in the next generation there will be no cell above it. Or if you have 2 in this position, there won't be any either, but if you have 2 over there, it will create a new one. So there are very simple rules for how do you create a new generation of something, or what happens in the next generation. So you run iterations of seeing how many cells are in different places, and there's an endless number of different types of rules one can use that give different results. One of the most well-known ones is the game of life, invented by a gentleman named Conway, which it's on a 2-dimensional grid, and the simple rules are, as far as I remember, like cells will be born or they will die. So they will be born if there are either 2 or 3 filled in cells next to it. As far as I remember, they will die if there's less, or they will die if there's more. So it's sort of an example of overpopulation or underpopulation, like there has to be some parents for the next cell. Anyway, it creates some amazingly surprising patterns and various things that move and that create complicated structures, and some of which are stable, some of which will keep moving in various ways. And now so one of the guys who studied the thing about criticality, they did a similar thing with a sand pile experiment, similar to me putting sand out on the floor. So like what we have here, we have a system where we have little stacks of sand. We got to make it a little more simple. We put it in a grid, and we say there can either be 0, 1, 2, or 3 grains of sand on top of each other. If it reaches 3 and we dump one on top of a pile of 3, it will tumble over, and the 4 grains of sand will be distributed to the cells around it. and they have different colors here. So now the first one, you can't see it, but that's a critical self-organization. To the human eye, this would look about the same as if I had randomly distributed different heights in different places. We have difficulty seeing the difference with our normal perceptions. But so somebody has essentially dropped piles of sand for quite a while, some a few hundreds of thousands of times, and it has ended up like that. And the result is that whenever we dump a piece of sand and we follow these simple rules, something will happen. Maybe something small, maybe something big. The stuff that happens is when a stack of grain is tumbling over, it will hit some other grains of sand that will hit some other ones like dominoes that are hitting each other. And it follows the power law distribution, meaning that most of the time it's small things that happen. Sometimes it's huge things. So sometimes you will dump a grain of sand and the whole pile is like turning over like dominoes. And that's the critical state. So they did millions of simulations like that to see if they could simulate some different types of phenomena that happen in nature, and they sort of figured out the laws of it. And what's interesting is once a system like that is in the critical state, you don't really know what the hell is going to happen. There's no direct correlation between what you do. You add one piece of of sand and the whole pile might come tumbling down, or nothing happens. It's a little like earthquakes and many other things. There might be a huge 10.0 earthquake, but most of the time there's not. And we humans haven't gotten very good at understanding it. But it's still, we've learned to appreciate the use of it. For example, forest fires is the self-organization of forests. When there are too many trees, or it's time to renew things, or just because, so there's a forest fire, and when that happens, it's like an avalanche that various things tumble over and other things pop up in its place, which is also what happens with evolution. This is a little complicated, but they made it a system evolution with a number of different species that depended on each other, and they got that to match exactly on an evolutionary pattern. One thing that's interesting about evolution is actually that it's not happening all the time, which this model tends to show, that it's more like nothing much happens most of the time, but once in a while a hell of a lot of things happen at the same time, which is sort of what one can find in the fossil record. It's not like every day a reptile is trying to become more like a bird. It's just it stays a reptile for millions of years, and once in a while something happens, which is some kind of avalanche of different things come tumbling down, or a meteor hits or something. It doesn't really matter what. The distribution is roughly the same, whether it's a meteor or whether it's just sort of happened by itself because various things depended on others. So in evolution, it's the theory of punctuated equilibrium, which means nothing happens most of the time, but once in a while the dominoes fall and lots of evolution happens in a very short period of time. Now, what this adds up to self-organization as essentially the most efficient state that can be reached dynamically. It's not necessarily the best way of organizing things. You shouldn't necessarily organize your library or your computer in a self-organized critical state, although that would be interesting. But for large numbers of independent agents that act together, it's the most efficient way it just happens to organize itself. Like traffic, for example. It's not just people randomly driving around on the road, even if they follow certain rules. It's not the most efficient thing. The most efficient thing would be all the cars drove 50 kilometers per hour, 80 kilometers per hour, exactly right after another, but that would take more organization. This is the kind of thing that happens by itself. The body? Well, the human body would tend to do it too. There's neurons, there's the different things that happen in the body, that most of the time things such as they seem stable and balanced. And if there's something that needs to happen, then it happens sort of rather quickly when one gets sick or something. Similar kind of thing. It seems to happen at all levels. It's sort of a fractal kind of thing. It's also, even though we have some rules for it, it's also still sort of a bit mysterious what the hell all of that really means and what one can do with it. Okay, but what it means that a system is in a state of self-organized criticality is essentially that everything is sort of already wound up. It's ready to go. It doesn't mean it will go anywhere fantastic, but it means something is ready. Dominoes are ready to tumble over, avalanches are ready to happen, and remember it can be both. It's not necessarily a negative thing. Avalanches sound sort of negative, but it's also that fantastically wonderful things can be almost ready to happen if you just sort of push the system in the right place. If something happens, something else is likely to happen. Mostly it's small things, but sometimes it's big things. You know the idea of the butterfly effect. It's usually used about chaos, but actually it applies just as well or even better to system in a critical state. Very small actions might have a huge effect. Most of the time they don't, but a butterfly batting its wings in one place might start a hurricane somewhere else. But in a critical system, it's not a question of that it's something horribly chaotic that happens. Normally, you roughly know the kind of things that happen. If it's in a pile of sand, what's going to happen? I mean, the sand will slide down. You know that. You don't know exactly when. But at your very small effect, it has the opportunity of doing something. Let's see on the internet, if you're very well connected with other people, or you're just part of the internet and everybody you know, they know other people, and it's all sort of a big system that already has pretty much self-organized itself. So if you are in a system of equilibrium, if the internet was in equilibrium, nothing would happen if you send an email to somebody. That happens in certain large companies too, maybe. If you're in a system of chaos, something random happens. You send an email, your car blows up or something. It's not nice either, but complexity, the idea is something potentially useful could happen. Most of the time, nothing much happens, but you could send it to just the right person who sends it to somebody else, and tomorrow it's all over the internet, and you got a million visitors on your website, and you're rich, and you're knighted by the Queen of England. It can all happen very quickly. No, but you can still set things up so it's more or less likely. It's not, I mean, when exactly it happens, it's not random either. There's a certain intelligence built into the system. We're not very good at understanding it yet. We could become better at it, and we could have a certain awareness of that you are in a system like that. Right. Like there's something we're missing to understand it. We're often a little too logical about it, or I don't know. Anyway, now what does that have to do with freedom? That's a good question. Well, this conference had free in the title, so I had to fit it in somewhere. But it does fit in. There are several different types of definitions of freedom. This was from Wikipedia, the philosophy of freedom. This is one kind of freedom. There are several others, but this is more sort of cognitive freedom. But it's like you can decide to do something and then you do it. You can do something that's according to your values, do good things, or you can just sort of randomly decide to do whatever you want to do, whether it makes sense or not. This is a certain type of freedom, but part of the point is, well, what is the result of that? None of this guarantees that you're going to get much out of that. And I will give you some examples of that. But first I'll talk about several other kinds of freedom. In science, freedom is not really a subject of science, but one uses words like degrees of freedom, which essentially means that something has variable parameters that can vary in different dimensions, and that gives a certain freedom. So in science, it usually means that things can move in different ways, and that gives a certain freedom. I will add something to what freedom is. Well, like freedom to mean something, you got to get a result from it. You want to get something out of it. So we could also say it's the potential to do small actions that make a big positive difference for you. You feel more free if the things you do have a bigger and better effect in your life. So it could be regarded as a degree of leverage, of amplification in your choices. I do something, it makes a difference. I will be more free if I happen to be in the right place at the right time and the right things happen. So for example, let's say I I'm in the position to donate to you 10 or let's say 100 square miles of the Sahara. It's free, it's already paid for, you can do with it whatever you want. It's yours. The sky's the limit, you can build anything there you want. There's billions of tons of sand you can build it with, just go ahead. Is that freedom? Maybe not, because it would be a hell of a lot of work to do anything with that. It doesn't matter if it was free. If I give you this car, it's a very nice car. It comes with some bales of hay. Does that feel like freedom? Not really. If I give you this car that with the keys in the ignition, it's all tanked up, it's ready to go, it has GPS, you can go wherever you want. Is that freedom? Yes, yeah, okay, well so why does that feel more like freedom? I mean, really you have as much cognitive freedom with either one. You're free to choose to do whatever you want with it. It's equally free. I give these things to you. So why is this more freedom? Is this freedom? Well, you get a lot of water for free. They do whatever you want with it. They don't look very happy. This is freedom. Well, still, it involves a lot of water and some people. Why is this more freedom? Well, part of the point is what kind of system are you living in? Like, it feels like freedom if you're in a system where things are already wound up. You have dominoes around you that when you push them, things happen. When you're in a flying car and it will actually do something when you turn the steering wheel, it makes a difference. Then the freedom is worth something. And the point of a critically self-organized system is that most things are fairly well wound up. They're ready to go, not just for your sake, for everybody else's sake too. So it maximizes how much you can do with the things that are there for everybody. If you wanted to maximize it for yourself, you might want to do something better than that. But for everybody who's involved, it's a very efficient way of having maximum freedom for the most people. So here's a bit of a theory. Do you have more freedom within a network that's complex in the sense that it's self-organized? There's a certain inherent mysterious intelligence in it. Your freedom is potentially more useful if the network is in a critical state. And how about this one? The value of a network is proportional to its complexity. Well, that's a little preposterous, but we'll compare it with, there are different laws about what's the value of a network. A lot of you know this already. Broadcaster in the 1930s decided the value of a network is the number of viewers or listeners or members you have. If you have twice as many listeners, the network is worth twice as much. That's simple, because it's one way. Then Metcalfe's law was in a telecom network, or if it's just a question of email, for example, the value of a network is proportional to the square of the number of users, which means you can make more connections between them. So there are twice as many users in the system. It becomes 4 times as valuable because you can connect, it's exponential how you can, or it's what you square it with how many people you can connect together. There's Reed's law, which goes a step further, which says that it's exponential essentially because you can create groups within it. Like, not just can you write something to everybody, but you can get together with any number of people within the network and create something with them. These are all potential. It doesn't mean that the internet automatically has an exponential value. It's potential value. But I thought it's cool to make laws, so I wanted to make one too. So I just made this one, which says that the value of a network is proportional to its complexity. It's quite easy to say because complexity is not very well defined. It's sort of mysterious, and nobody agrees on it, and there's no good way of measuring it. But essentially, the other laws are examples of networks becoming more complex. It's not very complex if you can only communicate one way to the listeners. It's a little better if they can call each other and say hello. It's better if they can create groups, and it's better the more things they can do. So a lot of the cool things we're doing on the internet are really adding more complexity. It adds a fractal layer so that there are more things you can do under the surface, and it's not necessarily obvious where that goes and what you can do with it. So it would be great if we could measure it too, but I thought it was a cool thing to say. Now, what also happens is, potentially, if you're in a critical system, things might just line up for you, which is the being in the flow, that somehow you feel like everything is happening in the right way, things are lining up, you call somebody and they happen to be just the right person who connects you up with somebody else, who gives you the book you need to read and who gets you the financing you want, and everything is just moving very easily. And that's one of the potential things that happen in a critically self-organized network. Not automatically, not necessarily for everybody. So we maybe need to develop a sixth sense of knowing where exactly the point is where it makes the biggest difference. We could also say that there's freedom on the edge in the critically self-organized system, which is to some degree the edge between equilibrium and chaos. And so being on the edge is sort of where you find the most possibilities, where when you push the buttons, more things will happen. It's a potentially dangerous place to be, but surprisingly, it's also stable, because a critically self-organized system will continue to be critically self-organized. It will change into another system, like in the sand pile, when I drop another grain of sand and there's an avalanche, it will end up in another critically organized state, because the wave of sand will just stop exactly where the friction is a little too much, where it's just ready to do another thing, but it doesn't. So if you drop another grain of sand on it again, it's again ready to go. Not a huge avalanche, but most of the time little things. So it's a stable place, but it's a different sort of way of becoming comfortable with what's an edge is, and what's the best place, what's the most efficient place to be effective in a network. But okay, on the edge, more on freedom. Not all freedom is worth having. You want mainly the freedom that makes a difference. Where you have the most options, you get the most bang for your buck. The usefulness of freedom depends on the complexity of the system around you. So I'm saying the more you can have the good kind of complexity around you and live in a complex system and be comfortable with that, the more kinds of freedom would be available to you. A lot of this I learned from this book by Per Bak, which is quite readable. It has science in it, but it also explains it very well. This is me. This is this presentation on SlideShare, if you want to look at some of it again. Some of the science stuff was a little dense. And that was it.